France, August 1944. The road to Chartres was mud and metal. Rain turned every ditch into a trap, and the Sherman tanks of the 3rd Armored Division were dying in it. Not from enemy fire, but from heat. Engines screamed, clutches smoked, and transmissions locked in place. One by one, the tanks stopped, their hatches opening like exhausted lungs. Staff Sergeant Raymond "Red" Hanlon jumped from his jeep, grease on his sleeves, wrench in hand. He'd been here before. Same smoke, same curse. The Germans didn't need to destroy American armor. The machines were doing it themselves. He climbed onto the side of a Sherman, kicked the overheated transmission cover, and spat. "She's not broken," he muttered. "She's choking." The problem was simple and stupid. The Sherman's cooling system was built for clean test tracks, not for the mud of France. Once the air filters clogged, heat turned the gearboxes into ovens. Every mile forward was a gamble. Command's answer was predictable. Wait for replacements. Hanlon's answer was not. That night, while artillery rumbled in the distance, he and his crew worked in the dark behind a barn. They stripped the tank's rear assembly, tore out the cooling fan, and replaced it with a part scavenged from a wrecked transport truck. The fit wasn't perfect. It wasn't supposed to be. "Regulation says don't touch the transmission," his corporal warned. "Regulation doesn't drive this thing," Hanlon replied. When dawn came, the modified Sherman rumbled to life. The engine sounded different, deeper, angrier. Hanlon climbed inside, grinned, and slammed the throttle forward. The tank lunged like it had been waiting its whole life. He drove it across the field, 40 tons of steel moving faster than any Sherman had a right to. The crew shouted over the roar, "You're gonna blow it up!" "Maybe," Hanlon said, eyes fixed ahead. "But at least it'll die moving." Behind him, the other tank sat cold and still. Ahead, the horizon trembled under the weight of his defiance. That morning, one mechanic decided to break the rules, and in doing so, he made history move twice as fast. Ask anyone about the Sherman tank, and you'll hear the same story, that it was slow, thin-skinned, a coffin on tracks. The myth has lived longer than the men who drove it, but myths aren't built from numbers. They're built from noise. The truth was more complicated. The M4 Sherman was never meant to outgun a Tiger. It was meant to outlast it. Its armor could take a hit and keep moving. Its engine could be repaired in hours, not days. It wasn't elegant, but it was unstoppable when it worked. And in the summer of 1944, that "when" became a curse word. The Sherman's biggest flaw wasn't design, it was bureaucracy. Its top speed was limited by a factory-installed governor that restricted the engine's revolutions to protect the transmission. It kept the tanks safe for inspection reports, but useless in pursuit. To the men fighting across France, those limits weren't safety measures. They were suicide notes. Hanlon knew it. He watched tanks bog down and die on the road to Chartres because the army didn't trust them to go faster. He'd memorized the manual, then ignored it. "They built her to live long," he told his crew. "But I need her to live fast." The manuals were written by engineers in Detroit. Men who'd never been shelled, never seen a panther crest a hill. To them, regulations were order. To Hanlon, they were handcuffs. So when he ripped out the cooling fan and replaced it with a modified truck part, he wasn't rebelling for glory. He was rebelling for survival. Every battlefield innovation begins as a broken rule. The British called it field modification. The Americans called it insubordination. Hanlon didn't care what they called it. He cared that his men could drive farther, faster, before the Germans could react. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that his illegal fix would ripple across Europe. Within months, hundreds of mechanics would copy his design. Shermans that once crawled now sprinted. Convoys that stalled now surged. And somewhere in a smoky field command post, a general would demand to know how the hell his tanks had doubled their speed overnight. The answer wasn't in the manuals. It was in the hands of one grease-stained sergeant who refused to slow down. The M4 Sherman was a machine of compromises. Fast enough, light enough, reliable enough. But beneath its reliability hid a flaw no one wanted to admit. The transmission ran too hot for the war it was fighting. The Sherman's power came from its Ford GAA V8, a 500-horsepower gasoline engine built from aircraft DNA. It was loud, proud, and thirsty. But the transmission, the complex heart that converted all that power into movement, sat cramped inside a steel box with minimal ventilation. On paper, it was fine. On the fields of France, it was a furnace. At 20 miles per hour, the gearbox overheated. Oil thinned, gears slipped, clutches fused. In the middle of a pursuit, that meant one thing. The column stopped, the enemy escaped, and men died waiting for tow cables. The official solution? Reduce sustained speed to prevent wear. Hanlon read that memo and nearly tore it in half. He'd been a mechanic before the war. Farm equipment, trucks, anything that moved. He knew a design that was choking itself when he saw it. "We're not wearing them down," he told his crew. "We're cooking them alive." The problem wasn't strength. It was airflow. The factory-installed cooling fans built for American test grounds couldn't handle the dust and mud of Europe. They clogged after a few hours, trapping heat inside the transmission housing. Hanlon's sergeant found the first clue by accident: a busted supply truck abandoned near Mortain. Inside it was a civilian-grade cooling fan, larger and lighter than the Sherman's standard part. Hanlon measured it, grinned, and said, "She'll fit if you make her." They scavenged more parts from broken vehicles, belts, bearings, even tractor housings from local French farms. The Frankenstein assembly that came out of it looked ridiculous, a mix of military and farm machinery welded together by necessity. According to regulation, it was illegal, unauthorized field modification, immediate court-martial if discovered. But in the 3rd Armored Division, paperwork didn't move tanks. Grease and grit did. When Hanlon installed the new fan, he noticed the difference instantly. The airflow doubled. Engine temperatures dropped within minutes. The transmission stopped screaming. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. For the first time since Normandy, a Sherman under his command could run full throttle for hours without melting down. The official engineers might have seen a breach of design. Hanlon saw a breakthrough of survival. That night, as he watched the tank idle in the dark, the sound wasn't strain anymore. It was rhythm, the heartbeat of a machine finally breathing right. Before Hanlon's illegal fix, the numbers told a story no general wanted to hear. A Sherman tank broke down on average every 240 miles of operation. 1 in 10 suffered a transmission failure so severe it required a replacement unit. In field conditions, that meant weeks of delay, and in war, weeks meant graves. At a full load, the Sherman's 30-ton frame demanded torque the gearbox couldn't sustain. The friction alone could raise temperatures past 260 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to boil the oil, warp the clutch plate, and fuse the gear teeth. Mechanics called it death by degrees. Every stalled tank slowed a column. Every stopped column halted an advance. On a narrow French road, one immobilized Sherman could block 50 vehicles. Fuel trucks, medics, artillery, and reinforcements. That was how the Germans survived longer than they should have. They didn't need to destroy American tanks. They only had to make them stop moving. The Panther and Tiger hunted at range, but the real killer was heat. Hanlon understood the hidden cost better than anyone. He began keeping notes. How long before the fan clogged? How far before the temperature spiked? His ledger read like a mechanic's death diary. 3 tanks per day sidelined. 6 hours wasted each time. 12 men waiting idle. He calculated something command never had the courage to print. If the cooling system worked as designed, the Sherman's practical road speed wasn't 25 miles per hour. It was 15. That was fatal math. Because German counterattacks depended on speed, fast armor cutting off supply lines, striking from hidden woods, disappearing before retaliation. Every time a Sherman stalled, the Panthers gained ground they hadn't earned. But Hanlon also saw the solution buried inside those numbers. If he could lower operating temperature by even 20 degrees, the gears would stay smooth, the oil thick, the engine efficient. And if the fan could cycle air faster, the tank's governor could be overridden safely. That meant higher revolutions, more speed. To headquarters, it was mechanical trivia. To Hanlon, it was survival calculus. He scribbled his own equation on the back of a ration box. Less heat equals more torque equals more speed equals fewer deaths. It wasn't pretty, but it was the truth. If the Sherman could move just 5 miles per hour faster, it wouldn't have to fight the Panther head-on. It could outflank it, kill it from the side, live to roll another mile. Speed wasn't luxury anymore. It was armor. Night fell over a small farm outside Chartres. The front line was only a few miles away, close enough that every thunder of artillery rattled the tin roof of the barn. Inside, under blackout lamps, Staff Sergeant Raymond read Hanlon and his mechanics worked like thieves. A Sherman sat in the center, stripped to its ribs. Its engine block was open, fan assembly removed, bolts scattered across the dirt floor. The crew worked in silence, covered in oil and adrenaline. "This is insane," muttered Corporal Jenkins, tightening a wrench with shaking hands. "They'll throw us in Leavenworth if they find out." Hanlon wiped sweat from his face with the back of his sleeve. "They can court-martial me when they catch up," he said. "Until then, we roll." The new cooling fan, scavenged from a GMC truck, looked nothing like standard issue. Its blades were wider, pitched sharper, and built for airflow, not regulation. It wasn't supposed to fit, but Hanlon had filed the housing himself until it did. He swapped belts, adjusted tension, then bolted a makeshift air scoop cut from a wrecked German half-track. It looked crude, ugly, but beautiful in its defiance. Outside, rain drummed against the barn. The crew worked faster. A single lantern flickered, reflecting off the bare steel of the tank's belly. Finally, Hanlon stood back, breathing hard. "Fuel her," he said. The mechanic poured in gasoline. Hanlon climbed onto the hull, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, then roared to life, louder, deeper than before. The air intake whined, the new fan slicing air with a high metallic hum. Gauges flickered to green. "Temperature?" he shouted. "Stable!" Jenkins yelled back, disbelief in his voice. Hanlon revved the throttle. The Sherman jolted, treads biting into the mud. He grinned, pushed harder. The tank surged forward through the barn doors, splintering wood and scattering rainwater. The roar echoed through the valley, a sound of raw power, unapproved, unregulated, and unstoppable. At 32 miles per hour, the tank tore across the open field. Mud flew. The gearbox whined, but it held. The gauges stayed cool. For the first time since Normandy, a Sherman was outrunning its own myth. "Jesus, Red," Jenkins shouted over the noise. "You'll blow the engine." Hanlon's laugh was half joy, half rebellion. "Then we'll build another one." By morning, the rumor had already spread through the division. "Hanlon's tank runs like a jeep," one mechanic said. Another added, "He broke the law and it works." When the colonel found out, he was furious, until he saw the speed test results. A standard M4A3 hit 24 mph on open terrain. Hanlon's modded tank hit 31.5. The officer stood silent, watching it roll by, exhaust flaring like a furnace. "You understand this is unauthorized, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir," Hanlon said. "But she's moving, isn't she?" The colonel didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. Sometimes victory doesn't need permission. It just needs motion. The next morning, the field report started to look strange. Convoy delays dropped. Breakdowns decreased. Maintenance logs showed fewer overheated transmissions, fewer stuck columns. Somewhere between the battle maps and the supply routes, the math of movement had quietly changed. Hanlon's tank wasn't a miracle. It was a virus. Mechanics from other companies heard about the modification and copied it. First one, then three, then dozens of crews started scavenging truck fans, widening air intakes and shaving governors off engines. No memos, no approvals, just wrenches, torches, and midnight courage. Within 2 weeks, commanders began to notice. The 3rd Armored Division's average advance speed jumped from 15 to 28 miles per hour. Their convoys outran radio schedules. Patrols that once took 5 hours were finishing in 2. Someone in Ordnance Headquarters sent a cable demanding explanation. The reply came back handwritten. Field adaptation. Working fine. Recommend you don't ask. By September, at least 40% of the Shermans on the Western Front carried some version of Hanlon's illegal fix. In most units, no one even remembered who started it. It was just called the French fan. But the data told the truth. Mechanical downtime fell by nearly half. Fuel efficiency improved. The tanks maneuvered through mud better. And for the first time, Shermans could maintain chase speed with fast-moving recon vehicles. The Germans noticed too. Reconnaissance reports complained, enemy armor movement now extremely rapid, impossible to predict deployment. In headquarters, officers still debated whether to reprimand Hanlon, but by then his modification was too widespread to stop. Logistics officers quietly adjusted their manuals, pretending it had always been standard. Nobody wanted to put their signature on the disobedience that was winning them battles. Hanlon never asked for credit. He just kept repairing tanks. Faster, quieter, prouder. We didn't make them perfect, he said. We made them go. And that was enough. Because the math of the front had flipped again. Less heat, less waiting, more speed. One man's crime had become an army's advantage. In a war defined by factories, it was a single mechanic, not a general, who proved that rebellion could outpace regulation. August 1944. The 3rd Armored Division was pushing toward Chartres. Fast. Too fast, according to headquarters. The map said their columns shouldn't have reached the outskirts for another 48 hours. But Hanlon's battalion didn't care about maps. They cared about momentum. The new modified Shermans were flying. 30 tons of steel charging through French farmland like angry freight trains. Hanlon rode shotgun in the lead tank, headset crackling with laughter and disbelief. Jesus, Red, we're outrunning our own supply trucks. Then they'd better learn to drive faster, Hanlon shouted back. The roads were chaos. Mud, burned-out wagons, retreating Germans. Normally the Shermans would have bogged down in the ruts, but not this time. The modified cooling systems hummed steadily, fans screaming like jet engines. They tore through villages, over hedgerows, across creeks the enemy thought impassable. German rear guards had planned to ambush the Americans on the D-28 road, assuming they'd crawl in at 10 miles per hour. Instead, the Shermans arrived 2 hours early. Engines roaring, guns already leveled. The ambush never happened. The Germans barely had time to light their fuses before they were overrun. A captured officer later said, "We thought we were fighting the same tanks we'd beaten before. We were wrong." By sunset, Hanlon's unit had covered 70 miles in a single day, the longest single armored advance in their division's history. Commanders at corps level were stunned. They must be misreporting their position, one colonel said. But reconnaissance planes confirmed it. The 3rd Armored had broken through every expected resistance line. When fuel finally ran low, the men dismounted to stretch their legs. Their uniforms were caked in mud, their faces streaked with oil, but their grins were electric. Jenkins slapped the side of the tank. "She didn't even cough once, Red." Hanlon patted the armor affectionately. "Guess the old girl just needed to breathe." In the after-action report, the division commander wrote a single line that no one understood at first. Speed achieved through field ingenuity. He never mentioned Hanlon by name. He didn't have to. Every mechanic on the front knew who had started it. The enemy would later call it the American Rush. Tanks that appeared faster than maps could update, engines that refused to die, crews that drove like they were chasing time itself. In truth, they were chasing survival, and one man's midnight crime had given them the power to catch it. That night, Hanlon's tank idled outside Chartres, its fan humming in the dark. He sat on the turret, listening to the sound he'd built with his own hands, a sound that now echoed across the entire front. It was the rhythm of rebellion turned into progress. 2 weeks after the breakout at Chartres, the summons came down from headquarters. Staff Sergeant Raymond "Red" Hanlon was to report to the Divisional Ordnance Office immediately. The letter didn't say why, but he already knew. He walked into the tent still smelling of fuel, boots muddy, uniform sleeves rolled to the elbows. Inside, a cluster of officers waited. Clipboards, scowls, clean uniforms that hadn't seen a wrench in months. At the head of the table sat a colonel from Army Ordnance Command, expression carved from stone. "Sergeant Hanlon," the colonel began, "you've been accused of unauthorized alteration of government property, specifically mechanical modifications to the M4A3 Sherman transmission and power system." Hanlon stayed silent. "Are you aware this constitutes a breach of Technical Order 1756B, paragraph 5? Hanlon nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Then why did you do it?" He met the man's eyes. "Because it worked." The colonel frowned. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that matters," Hanlon replied. There was a pause, long, brittle, uncomfortable. Then another voice spoke from behind the tent flap. Calm, confident, commanding. "Let's see this miracle machine of yours." Every officer in the room straightened. General Eisenhower had just walked in. Hanlon blinked. He hadn't expected him. Minutes later, they stood outside as the modified Sherman rumbled to life. Its engine thundered steady and smooth. The new fan roared, cutting the air with a clean metallic hiss. Hanlon climbed onto the hull, saluted, and took the controls. "Sir," he said, "with your permission." Eisenhower nodded. Hanlon hit the throttle. The tank shot forward across the field like it had been kicked by God himself. 30 tons of steel moving at the speed of certainty. Dust rose in a long, perfect line. When he brought it back around, the engine was still cool, the gauges steady, the smell of burnt clutch gone. The general climbed up, checked the instruments himself, and smiled faintly. "You did this without approval?" "Yes, sir." "And it works?" "Yes, sir, every time." Eisenhower looked at the colonel, then back at Hanlon. "Then from now on, Sergeant, consider it approved." The tent fell silent when they returned. The colonel cleared his throat. "Your modification will be documented, tested, and standardized for all field units." Hanlon just nodded. "With respect, sir, it already is." Outside, mechanics cheered as word spread. "Red's fix is official," they shouted. Hanlon didn't celebrate. He just lit a cigarette, leaned against his tank, and watched the smoke twist upward. He'd broken the law and rewritten the rule book. In that moment, grease-stained hands had done what bureaucracy never could, made the Sherman a legend. When the war ended, nobody remembered the paperwork, but everyone remembered the speed. The official records never listed Raymond "Red" Hanlon as an inventor, only as a maintenance sergeant. His name didn't appear in engineering reports or technical manuals. But the modification he created, the illegal fix that doubled a Sherman's endurance, quietly became part of the Army's standard procedure by 1945. History would later call it the Hanlon Mod. For him, it was never about fame. It was about motion, keeping men alive by keeping their tanks alive. "If it moves, it fights," he used to say. "If it stops, it dies." The irony was perfect. The same army that had threatened him with court-martial now printed his design into every field repair guide. Official doctrine simply called it Enhanced Cooling Assembly, Field Variant A. No one asked where it came from. They already knew. The math told its own story. In the 6 months after his modification spread, the division's average mechanical downtime dropped by 42%. Convoy efficiency doubled. For the first time in the campaign, armor outran its own fuel trucks. One officer put it best in a field memo. Sergeant Hanlon made speed a weapon. That was the heart of it. Not heroism, not rank, just understanding that the battlefield rewards motion more than obedience. While engineers back home debated theories, Hanlon's tanks were proving them wrong in real time. His rebellion had turned into rhythm. The Sherman tank was never perfect, but in his hands, it became what it was always meant to be: a survivor. After the war, Hanlon went back to fixing tractors on his family's farm in Ohio. When neighbors asked what he did overseas, he'd shrug and say, "Just kept things running." He never mentioned that for a brief moment, one illegal idea made an entire army move faster than war itself. When the smoke settled over Europe, the stories of generals filled the books. But in the garages, the men remembered the mechanics. Raymond Red Hanlon never earned a medal, never wrote a memoir. He didn't have to. Every Sherman that rolled a little faster, every convoy that made it home instead of stalling in mud, carried his fingerprints. He had broken a rule to save a life, and the math of that decision outlasted him. War had taught him one truth: speed isn't made in engines. It's made in minds that refuse to stop thinking. The Army called it an improvement. The men who drove called it what it really was: freedom in motion.